Okay, you've probably seen the headlines for years, right? This idea that China is setting these debt traps all over the world. But what if the story we've all been told, especially the one about Sri Lanka, isn't the whole story? Let's dig into what really happened.
You know, this quote is a really great way to frame our whole discussion today. Was Sri Lanka's massive debt crisis the result of some malicious, brilliant Chinese plot? Or is the reality, well, a lot messier? We're going to look at the evidence, and I think you'll be surprised.
So let's get on the same page. What is debt trap diplomacy? It's this theory that a country, in this case China, will intentionally drown a smaller country in loans it can't possibly repay. The goal? To then seize valuable assets, like a port or an airport, when they default.
And whenever you hear this term, there's always one example that comes up. It's the poster child for the whole theory, the Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka. The story you hear is that China funded this giant, useless project just so they could take it over. It's Exhibit A. Okay, so here's the crucial question. If this was a Chinese trap designed to make Sri Lanka default specifically to China, you'd expect China to be their biggest creditor, right? The one holding all the cards? Well, let's actually look at the numbers.
And this is where the popular story just completely falls apart. Look at this chart. The biggest chunk of Sri Lanka's debt, almost half of it, wasn't owed to China at all. It was owed to private creditors through what are called international sovereign bonds. Think Wall Street, not Beijing. China's share? A pretty small 13%. This one chart changes everything.
So, why does that matter so much? Well, not all debt is the same. Think of it this way. The private loans from Wall Street were like a high-interest credit card, just eating up more than half of Sri Lanka's debt payments. The Chinese loans, on the other hand, were more like a long-term mortgage with a lower interest rate, much more manageable.
And hey, don't just take our word for it. Over 180 leading economists from around the world signed a letter basically pointing the finger squarely at these private hedge funds. They said these guys made a fortune charging high-risk interest rates and then held up vital debt relief when everything went south.
All right, let's move on to the port itself, because its origin story is just as misunderstood as all the debt stuff.
So where did this idea for a port even come from? Was it cooked up in Beijing? Not even close. As you can see, this was a Sri Lankan dream, going back decades. It was a local idea that eventually became part of the national strategy, championed by their own president for his home district. The key thing to realize is that Sri Lanka was in the driver's seat on this one.
And get this, they were shopping the project around to everybody. They went to India, they looked for other international partners, but at the time, only China was willing to put up the money. This wasn't a project forced on them. It's one they desperately wanted and actively sought funding for.
Okay, so China didn't force the project on them, but they definitely seized the port when Sri Lanka got into financial trouble, right? I mean, that's the whole trap part of the story. Let's see what really went down.
$1.1 billion. Remember that number? That's how much cash a Chinese company paid Sri Lanka for a 99-year lease on the port. This wasn't a seizure. It was a commercial transaction.
And let's be super clear here. No debt was forgiven or canceled in this deal. Sri Lanka got a massive pile of cash, and what did they do with it? They turned around and used it to pay down other, more expensive loans, mostly to those Western creditors we talked about earlier. The original Chinese loans for the port? Those still had to be paid back separately.
So what about the scary claim that it's now a secret Chinese naval base? Well, the lease agreement explicitly says no military use, period. Who actually runs security? The Sri Lankan Navy. In fact, they moved their Southern Naval Command to the port. And if you're still skeptical, the port is subject to inspections by the U.S. Coast Guard.
So if the port wasn't the single cause, what did break Sri Lanka's economy in 2022? Well, like most huge economic disasters, it was never just one thing.
It was truly a perfect storm. You had years of domestic mismanagement, things like massive tax cuts at the absolute worst time. You had that huge pile of high-interest debt from private markets. And then boom, COVID hit, which has destroyed their tourism industry, a huge source of income. And on top of all that, global inflation threw gasoline on the fire.
All right, so that was the crisis. It sounds pretty bleak, but what does the situation look like today? Is the port just a failed asset sitting there? Let's look at what's happened since.
Remember how everyone called the port a white elephant, a totally useless project? Well, check this out. 151%. That is the staggering year-on-year growth in cargo volume the port handled by late 2025. It is far from a failure. It's becoming a bustling commercial hub.
And the story's not over. A Chinese company is now planning to invest another $3.7 billion to build a huge new oil refinery right there at the port. This is set to be the single largest foreign direct investment in Sri Lanka's entire history. That doesn't sound like a country trying to escape a trap, it sounds like a deepening partnership.
And it's not just the port that's bouncing back. The whole country is starting to turn a corner. GDP is growing again, that crushing inflation has been tamed, and they've rebuilt their financial reserves from basically zero. It's actually a remarkable turnaround.
So, let's wrap this up. Why does getting this one story right matter so much, especially to us here in the US? It's way more than just an academic debate about economics.
Look, the reason we went so deep on this one story is because these simple, catchy narratives, like debt trap diplomacy, have real-world consequences. They shape foreign policy, they influence how we see the world and our place in it. So the next time you hear a simple story about a really complex global issue, it's worth taking a beat to ask yourself, who benefits from me believing this? And what important details might they be leaving out? Because the real story is almost always more complicated, and frankly, a lot more interesting than the headline.